The pursuit of liberation is a central goal of yoga and Buddhism that comes from Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya is a philosophy of ancient India around 700 BC that heavily influenced yoga, Buddhism, and Ayurveda as well. And liberation is a concept, or moksha is a concept that comes from Sankhya, and moksha is also a goal of much of Indian philosophy. The idea behind liberation, or moksha, is the idea that the true self is just an eye, a great big eye that watches all of reality. And that eye is called Purusha. This eye of the true self has no body, it has no mind, it has no thoughts. It's just a passive watcher. It is a witness. It doesn't make choices. It just looks at reality. Well, why this philosophy of moksha? Why this philosophy of liberation? What's behind it all? Well, Sankhya says that you need to know how to let things go. You need to know how to have a bigger perspective. If something's bothering you, you may have to live with it and make the best of it. So it's best that you get over yourself, right? That's what Sankhya says. Also, everybody dies. And so we have to come to terms with our own death. We have to let our body go. We have to let our mind go. We have to let our thoughts go when we die. And that leaves us with only the true self behind, which Sankhya says is that watcher. The idea is that when you're liberated from yourself, your awareness will be united with the universal perspective, the primordial energy pool of prana. And in some ways, it's like that idea of ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that you let all of the temporal parts of your existence turn back to ashes, and all that's left is the eye of the true self. So in this idea, you're also letting go of your whole nature. You're letting go of all your preconceived ideas, all of your preconceived thoughts. And in a way, it's like your mind becomes like the mind of a baby. But it's not exactly that either. It's not as if you are just a watcher. When you are this watcher, you're no longer constrained by nature. You no longer have any nature at all. You have no preconceived ideas, no desires. And as you know from these philosophies of yoga and Buddhism and Sankhya itself, that desire is the cause of suffering. And that's why those philosophies try to eliminate all desires. Well, the idea is that when you have given up your nature entirely, you no longer have instincts. You're totally opened and you're totally unformed. This is a state called nirguna, that you don't have any qualities, no characteristics. And it's it can be attractive. There's some things that are attractive about it, because Sankhya says you should pursue the state of moksha in this life while you're still alive. And so when you do that, you're kind of erasing your nature in the process. And it's kind of like starting fresh or starting over again. I said that mind of a baby is kind of like the fresh new mind. It's like a tabula rasa. And so it's in a way, it's a new beginning. And for Sankhya and much of Indian philosophy, this is the notion of who God is. Brahma, the supreme God or the supreme state of being, has no form at all, no nature, no biases. And that kind of creates a theology of cultural relativism in a way, that that reality is beyond any individual nature. The truth has no nature. It's a kind of theology of cultural relativism. And yoga comes from that, and that's why a lot of yogis think of yoga as the most tolerant of all religions, as the most tolerant of all spiritual systems, because it says nothing is true. No nature is superior. The only superior state is this idea of having no nature at all, and this is what you should try to accomplish in your lifetime. Well, what do you think about that? Does God have no form? Or do you think God is love? I mean, both of those statements can't be true, right? Either God has no form or God is love. God is life. God is truth. God is goodness. So what do you think about God? Is God one of those? Is God any one of those? Love, life, truth, or goodness, or no form at all? This idea of is probably the most important spiritual question you'll ever ask, right? Because it is a really formative beginning to the spiritual life is your answer to this question. So if God has no form, then nothing can be said about God. Nothing can be known about God. You can only discuss God in negatives. You can only say God is not that. God is not that. God's not black. God's not white. God's not, not, a Democrat, not a Republican, et cetera, right? You can only say what God isn't, not what God is. And so therefore, you can't judge anyone. And also, by the way, it means nothing is wrong or nothing is right outside of this idea that God has no form to it. All right, let's talk about some scripture from Indian text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a popular Hindu text, kind of like the Hindu analog of the Bible. And it discusses some of these themes. Here, the theme of being completely neutral. Here's the quote. When a person overcomes the three gunas, he neither likes nor dislikes purity, light, passion, and delusion, which are the prominent modalities that arise from the gunas. He does not detest them when they are present, nor desire them when they are absent. Instead, he remains indifferent, undisturbed by the gunas, knowing that it is the gunas which are acting in all things, but not the self. Therefore, he remains alike in pleasure and pain. He is stable and equal towards a lump of earth or a lump of gold. He is equal towards the pleasant and unpleasant, towards criticism or praise, honor or dishonor, or friend or foe. Since he rises above the gunas, he does not take sides in any dispute, nor show any favor or preference for the dualities of life, and renounces the ambition and initiative to perform tasks. So that's very interesting. Renouncing the initiative to perform any task, not taking any sides in any dispute, and remaining indifferent and, by the way, undisturbed. Having no like or dislike, even for purity or passion or delusion, etc. All right, so that's the if God has no form model. If God is love, on the other hand, then God loves every person and wants the best for them. And therefore, God probably doesn't like it when people hurt themselves or hurt other people. Well, the trouble is that if you subscribe to the model that God is love, then the trouble is that some things we do aren't very loving, right? We're not always good at loving. At least I'm not. Hopefully you're better than me. So if God is love, then it means God doesn't like some things, and God isn't neutral anymore. Well, what do you think? Is neutrality more tolerant or less tolerant than love? Here's an interesting counterpoint here. In Christianity, indifference is considered to be the greatest evil, whereas in the Bhagavad Gita, it's considered to be the greatest good. So that is a kind of interesting cultural difference there. And it really highlights the difference of assessing mental health across cultures, right? Because if you have a culture of Christianity and you're sitting there with your client assessing their psychological wellness, and the client says, well, I'm totally indifferent to everything, you might say, oh, that's a terrible thing, right? But if you're in India assessing, a psychologist in India assessing the same thing, or you're a person who follows this belief, then you're going to say, oh, you must have achieved moksha, the holiest state of being. So isn't that isn't that interesting how the best of one is the worst of another? Well, what about moksha? In India, we should mention that not everyone follows Sankhya's model of moksha. Although these other systems do have a model of moksha, they don't use Sankhya's pathway to getting there. Many teachers of Indian spirituality do advocate a more life-affirming worldview than Sankhya does. And in some cases, those gurus will actually reinterpret Sankhya and say, okay, well, Sankhya is really saying this, not that. Or here's how we resolve this paradox, etc. So the Indian population itself is largely devotional to Hindu gods. And those Hindu gods have form. They're not formless. So even though Brahma is the formless and the supreme state of being that ultimately everyone should aspire to in that philosophy, most of the population is devoting themselves to Hindu gods that have form, and instead of the gunaless supreme state of Brahma. So yeah, not everyone follows Sankhya's models. Consider the Tantra tradition is something. Tantra tradition says, oh no, we've got to go through nature, not beyond nature. And Tantra has sort of been distorted and degenerated into a kind of sex practice, which really doesn't look like a path to enlightenment that much. But the original aims of it were a backlash against Sankhya, and it was a life-affirming backlash against Sankhya, yoga, and Buddhism. Imagine people who were very attached to their loved ones and cherished things, and when Buddhism came along and said you have to give up all desire, you can imagine there was probably a political or religious backlash to that, and that's exactly the case. It is true, and Tantra was a part of that. Trying to recover some of the, holiness of nature. So in some schools, even the school of Ayurveda, there's also praise of Shakti, which is the feminine creative energy. We've talked about this in some of the other talks on Sankhya, that the feminine side of reality is called Prakriti, and the products of Prakriti are considered to be products of ignorance, right? And that what Sankhya goes for is the male aspect of creation, which is consciousness or Purusha, and Moksha is on that side of Purusha. So other schools had a backlash against that. They were saying, hey, wait a second, no, the feminine creative energy is a good thing, and so those schools may praise Shakti. In any case, in many ways, I think Ayurveda turns the model of Sankhya upside down, partly by affirming the uniqueness of constitution rather than seeking total unity as in yoga, or total dissolution of the self into the primordial energy pool. That's just not what Ayurveda is looking for. Ayurveda doesn't try to escape the cycle of birth and death, but advocates for fertility. Ayurveda differentiates between true and false cravings rather than being liberated from all desire, having moksha from all desire. And Ayurveda seeks to preserve life rather than just seeking transcendence or moksha. Ayurveda advocates eating meat. It's all over the ancient texts, and so it really doesn't follow Ayurveda's model of Sankhya's model for sattva either. Well, what do you think? Is it good to have no preconceived ideas? No knowledge of what is true or false, or good or bad? Is it good to erase? Would you want to erase all of your preconceived ideas and experiences? Are all preconceived ideas bad, or just some of them? And how do you spin how do you spin having an open mind? Do you say, in the positive way, oh, a person's open-minded? Or do you say a person's uncertain or confused? Do you say a person's closed-minded or narrow? Or do you say a person's convinced or committed? So one of those is a sort of positive spin on it. To say a person's open-minded is usually the positive spin. To call them confused is the negative spin. To say that a person's convinced and committed is a positive spin, but to say a person's closed-minded or narrow is the same thing, but putting a negative spin on it. So how do you talk about these things? When a person is totally convinced about something, do you say they're closed-minded and narrow, or do you say they're committed? Are you a judgmental person? Have you judged slavery as being bad? Have you judged that eating at McDonald's is unhealthy? Have you judged that antibiotics are overused in the medical system? Do you have ideas about what it means to be a good parent, or even what it means to be a good person? So some of those are biases and judgments that may be good, right, or bad. What is your view on that? And what happens to common sense when a person's totally liberated from all preconceived ideas? If a person's liberated from their nature entirely, how does that person stay safe? How do they stay safe without pre-developed instincts? So I think that those are some challenging questions to the moksha model, even about love. Can you be in moksha and love someone at the same time? If you're liberated from all desires, can you still love someone? I think that those are some challenging questions to moksha, and so what is our final conclusion here? Well, the impulse behind studying moksha may be a good one, but it can also be taken too far. We need some liberation from ourselves. We need some humility. We need to get over our ego in certain cases. But we don't want to necessarily... But you can also take that too far. You can, if you're totally detached, totally aloof, totally indifferent, if you've erased yourself completely, that can be problematic too. It's a little nihilistic to try to erase yourself or your nature. So perhaps a balanced approach is best. Learn from some of the concepts and philosophical ideas of liberation, of theology, of moksha, but maybe not make it the ultimate goal of your existence. Maybe there's a way to bring heaven and earth together instead of just leaving earth to go to heaven entirely. Is the earth redeemable? Is there a way? Can the earth be holy? Can the earth be good? Is there a way to merge those together? I think those are some deeper philosophical questions.